This will be a lecture on the Russian Revolution, including the Russo-Japanese War, the 1905 Revolution, and the 1917 Revolution. So we start off with Russia's expansion. So Russia had been expanding their territory, and they wanted Korea and Manchuria, which is modern-day China. And this map is looking at Russia from sort of above, looking down at the globe. And you can see that Russia had expanded into Asia. This brought them into conflict with Japan, who was also expanding. And remember that Russia was still in search of a warm water port, so they're trying to get access to a warm water port. So in 1904, Russia went to war with Japan, who also wanted Manchuria and Korea. The battlefront was thousands of miles away from most of Russia's workforce and industry. The war placed great strain on Russia's industry, transportation, and supplies. Russia had been working on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, but it was not quite finished. Troops and supplies could not make the whole trip by rail, but they did use the railway to transport the troops and supplies to the eastern part of Russia, and that put a great strain on the cities in the west because they weren't able to get the raw materials for the factories or food for the people in the cities. So after negotiations broke down between Russia and Japan, Japan launched a surprise attack on Russia's eastern fleet at Port Arthur in China. Russia suffered 3 major defeats in the war, 2 in naval battles and 1 on land. Japan's complete defeat of Russia was a shock to Russia and the world. Tsar Nicholas of Russia had thought that Russia would easily defeat Japan and that would boost the morale of the Russian people. Instead, Russia was quickly defeated by Japan, and that's an example of the European people at the time thinking they were superior than other races in the world. And again, Tsar Nicholas even referred to the Japanese as monkeys. So again, an example of like how the Russians viewed themselves compared to other areas in the world. After the defeat of their Pacific Fleet, Russia had sailed their Baltic Fleet, renamed the Second Pacific Fleet, on a 7-month journey through the Suez Canal and around the Horn of Africa. When the Japanese intercepted the Russians on their way to Vladivostok, their only warm water port, the Russian fleet was pretty much annihilated. So Russia lost 8 battleships, many smaller ships, and about 5,000 men were killed. Japan only lost 3 torpedo boats and about 116 men. So again, this decisive defeat started to turn people against the Tsar. He had hoped that this would rally support for him, but when they were so soundly defeated by Japan, it turned people against him, and they started questioning his military leadership. Which leads us to the 1905 revolution, which takes place the same year. So again, Russia was humiliated by the loss to Japan. Workers in Russian cities were very frustrated by the war. So the Trans-Siberian Railway was used to transport troops and supplies to the eastern part of Russia, which caused food shortages. Prices also increased. Workers were laid off because factories couldn't get raw materials, which were usually shipped by the Trans-Siberian Railway. So since it was used to ship troops and supplies to the east to fight Japan, factories weren't getting their raw materials, so they laid off workers. Worker strikes increased, but they were unsuccessful. So it's kind of building this tension and pressure in Russia, which leads to Bloody Sunday. So in January of 1905, a priest named Father Gapon led a peaceful march to the Tsar's palace with hundreds of thousands of people. Their goal was to present a petition to the Tsar asking for better working conditions and to listen to the people. The soldiers guarding the Winter Palace fired on the marchers, killing hundreds, and this date became known as Bloody Sunday. In the aftermath, the revolt spread beyond the cities to the countryside and even to the military. The military was frustrated with the war with Japan. They had no faith in Tsar Nicholas's military leadership, and there were even mutinies on some of the battleships. So one crew on the battleship Potemkin overthrew and murdered their officers. Again, an example of how fed up the military was with these humiliating defeats. So what this forced the Tsar to do is it forced him to agree to allow for more rights and to set up a Duma or a parliament. And Duma is spelled D-U-M-A. This is huge. So typically, Russian czars had absolute power. They did not share it with their people. A parliament or Duma would change this. Tsar Nicholas also allowed for freedom of speech and of press. So the police, the army, and pro-Tsar gangs helped to restore order. However, as soon as things were calm, the Tsar began to ignore the promises he made. And then in 1914, Russia enters World War I, and for a brief moment, people are very excited, they're patriotic, they forget all of their troubles at home, they're ready to support Russia and the Tsar in World War I. So then we move to the Russian Revolution. And we're going to start with the revolutionary groups. So again, the name that we need to remember is Bolsheviks. So Russia was filled with revolutionary groups, and despite his efforts, the Tsar was never able to suppress them all. So some groups wanted a British-style constitutional monarchy. So again, that would be where there's a monarch, but there is also a constitution, so the people have some say in the government, and the monarch does not have absolute power. This was mostly popular among the upper and middle classes, both of which were very small groups in Russia, and some of the Mensheviks supported this. Other groups wanted to start a revolution, take land from the nobles, and give it to the peasants. Some wanted to use violence, while others were more peaceful. A third group wanted to overthrow the government and seize all property and share it evenly. This group was small and was not united. Some wanted to persuade others to join them, while a very small group wanted to take power by force. This group is called the Bolsheviks. So that's Bolsheviks. That is the group you need to remember, the Bolsheviks. So in February and March of 1917, the Tsar was overthrown and he was placed under house arrest. The revolt started spontaneously. The revolt started spontaneously. It was led by women and grandmothers who were upset because they couldn't feed their children and they couldn't buy fuel to heat their homes. So, here are a few reasons why the Tsar was overthrown. There were hungry, cold, underpaid, frustrated workers. Too many people had died in World War I, and Russia was tired. The Russian people were tired of fighting in World War I. Inflation was high, so the economy was suffering. There was not much confidence in the leadership of the Tsar because of the poor decisions he had made. And the people were angry at his wife, Alexandra. Again, she was a German princess. And when Nicholas went to the front to inspect the troops, Rasputin, who was the healer that Nicholas and Alexander had sort of hired to look after their son with hemophilia, Rasputin started to manipulate and try to gain power, and this frustrated the Russian people. Again, Rasputin is assassinated in 1916, and that's that fascinating story where he's like poisoned, stabbed, shot, rolled in a carpet, thrown in a river, and he escapes the carpet and dies of hypothermia. So, because the revolution began spontaneously, there wasn't a clear plan for how to run the government after the Tsar was removed from power. So they started a provisional government or temporary government. So again, the Tsar and his family were put under house arrest. A provisional or temporary government was formed, led by Alexander Kerensky. So that's Kerensky. That is an important name to remember. However, the provisional government had many rivals for power, like the Bolsheviks, and they never really had control over Russia. The provisional government wanted to set up a British-style democracy, to continue fighting World War I to support Russia's allies, and to respect the private ownership of property. However, they lost popularity rapidly because few people wanted to continue the war. In 1917, 2 million soldiers deserted, and the peasants began to seize land owned by nobles, and the provisional government refused to recognize their ownership of the land. There were many armed men in Russia, and they were not happy with the government. And finally, the Bolsheviks, one of the provisional government's oppositional parties, were well organized and willing to say or do anything to gain power, and that group was led by Lenin.